like to welcome you all back to our second session of the day for Varieties of Textual Experience. And special welcome to those of you who are just joining us now. This session is going to focus, we have three historians who will be speaking. I was just saying, I think their papers have been organized kind of inadvertently in the latitudinal order, right? Going from north to south. And my history of the book students, Tess and Eva, will be co-facilitating this session. So welcome back, everyone, and I'll turn it over to them.
So our first panelist today will be Joel Anderson. Joel teaches medieval history at the University of Maine. He graduated from Bates College in 2005 with a Bachelor in Science in History. He subsequently studied at the University of Oslo, the University of Iceland, and Cornell University, where he completed a PhD in medieval studies in 2015. His research, which revolves around the communications, networks, and legal apparatuses of the medieval church, has been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Norwegian Fulbright Foundation, among others.
Our second panelist will be Libby, who is a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow for Pedagogical Innovation in the Humanities in History and Classical Medieval Studies at Bates. Dr. Netting comes to Bates from the University of Texas at Austin, where she completed her dissertation, Morisco Survival, Gender, Conversion, and Migration in the Early Modern Mediterranean, 1568 to 1659. Her scholarship relies on extensive archival research in Spanish and Arabic. She is interested in recovering the history of people whose voices are not often heard, women, minorities, and working people. At Bates, she teaches courses on the intersections between the Islamic and European worlds in the medieval and early modern periods that incorporate new teaching methods.
And our last panelist for this section will be Sarah Watkins. She is a historian of gender, sexuality, and power in pre-colonial Rwanda. Her current manuscript, Mistress of the Drum, Intimate Politics in the State in Rwanda, 1750-1916, explores the role of queen mothers and other court intimates in Rwandan state formation. She earned her PhD in History and Feminist Studies from the University of California, Santa Barbara in 2014, and she is currently a visiting assistant professor of African and World History at Colby College. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you also to Megan for inviting me here today. I have something more like a presentation and less like a paper here today. And what I want to do is highlight two different strands of my research interests. One of which kind of focuses on material texts. We'll spend a bit of time puzzling over one particular material text that I've been interested in recently. And the second strand focuses on some of the kind of secondary discourses that surround these texts, so literary and historical accounts. So, as we just said, as a whole, my research addresses the communications, networks, and legal apparatuses of the medieval church. I focus particularly on the 13th and 14th centuries in Northern Europe. This is an age that sees a real exponential growth in the number of documents that are being issued by both royal and ecclesiastical authorities. The church is, in this era, a rather massive organization centered at Rome, and this is an era that sees a real rapid escalation of official communication mediated through text. So the kinds of questions I ask are, what happened when official documents and also documents bearing messengers started arriving on the northern edge of the medieval world? How did Norse clerics understand, produce, and use these media? So official documents, what do I mean by that? This would be one example, top right here, a papal bull issued in the 13th century. And when I say the northern world or the Norse world in this presentation, what I'm referring to is essentially the area in green on that map on the bottom right. So including the majority of modern-day Norway, overseas dioceses as well, in places like the Orkney Islands, the Faroe Islands, and two bishoprics in Iceland that will be quite crucial to the presentation. So I want to start today by, as I said, emphasizing one strand of my research, which emphasizes a kind of close attention to extant material artifacts from this world. I want to take a look at this document in particular and ask, how did this text come to be the way that it is? What was going on in its vicinity? How did this document bring people into distinct social and institutional relations? And I think these are kinds of questions that require focusing not just on the lexical content of the document, but also on its material form. So the object that you see before you here is housed in the National Archives of Norway, and it's a document issued by the Archbishop of Nidaros. And what you see at the bottom there are 8 seals. So seals are essentially the sort of authenticating token that stamps of approval that announce that these bishops have signed on that approve the content of this document. And the Archbishop's seal, I've added there through the magic of PowerPoint. It's no longer extant itself, but it would have been slightly larger than the other seals on display, which would have been his 7 subordinate bishops, so the 7 bishops underneath his authority. So the context for this document. The context is that there has been a provincial council called in Bergen, at which these bishops were asked to attend, and the King of Norway has also recently died, and his 12-year-old son is about to be crowned the new king. This is July in the year 1280. The Archbishop is responsible for doing this coronation, and he does indeed crown this boy king, but immediately afterwards, together with these 7 subordinates, he issues this document. Its express purpose is to publicize as widely as possible the oath that the new king supposedly swore as part of this coronation ceremony. And perhaps not coincidentally, the oath rather prominently includes several pledges that the king will uphold the rights and privileges of the church. So my approach has been to look at a document like this one as an attempt to construct public meaning, an effort to build consensus around a very specific understanding of the royal coronation. And I think the authors of this document use a variety of strategies to achieve these aims. First, there's a kind of textual strategy here. The text itself is in Latin, which speaks to the fact that this document is very likely for an ecclesiastical audience, perhaps even for a papal audience, should this document become central to a legal case in the future. But the king's oath, crucially, is also included in Norse. So it's included in Latin and also in Norse. Perhaps a kind of strategy that would ensure that there's no possibility for the king misunderstanding precisely what he swore to do with respect to these ecclesiastical rights and privileges. I think even more striking than these textual features are the document's physical and material features, which we have on display here. This is a rather remarkable display of unity. It's a visual organization of the archbishoprics' idealized ecclesiastical order, i.e., it is the archbishop and 7 of his subordinate bishops lined up, unified underneath his guidance, all signing on to the same understanding of this coronation ceremony. Moreover, I think for a contemporary audience, having these 8 seals attached in particular would have been especially remarkable. A rather simple reason for this, and that is that Nidaros, the archbishopric of Nidaros, was by far the most remote and the most isolated diocese in Christendom. So the archbishops in Nidaros, this is modern-day Trondheim on the northwest coast of Norway, would have been responsible for overseeing not just bishops elsewhere in Norway, so Bergen, Hamar, Stavanger, and Oslo, but also for overseeing bishops in the Orkney and Shetland Islands, the Faroe Islands, 2 bishops all the way out in Iceland, and then the loneliest bishop in all of Christendom, the Bishop of Greenland who had to see all the way out in Garva. So in a sense, what I'm arguing, or I should contrast this briefly with the situation in the Mediterranean. So there we have each one of those black dots is a bishopric, each one of the white ones an archbishopric. So a kind of crowded ecclesiastical geography.
On your top drawing,
Yes.
map, all the dots there represent one of those seals that was on the document you just showed us.
Close, but not quite. Many of them, including several of the overseas, the far overseas dioceses, so the two bishops in Iceland, the bishop of the Faroe Islands, the bishop of the Orkney and Shetland Islands as well. So rather remarkable, right, that all of these men would be in the same place at the same time. And I think for a Norse audience, they could not kind of fail to realize just how remarkable that would be just by looking at this document. And we can contrast that again with the crowded ecclesiastical geography in the south, where each of those black dots, the bishopric, each of the white ones, the archbishopric. So in a sense, what I'm arguing is that this document's communicative power stemmed from its condensation of the enormous geographic and political domain of the Norse archbishopric onto a single sheet of parchment. And incidentally, for people really in the know, several of these bishops intensely disliked, if not hated, each other. Were involved in various disputes, various lawsuits against one another. Yet again, nevertheless, all signing on to this same understanding of the royal coronation ceremony. So this kind of analysis here I see as part of an effort to reconstruct the atmosphere in which documents that were written, sealed, and used. And I hope what it underlines is that missives like this one were not simply neutral recordings of fact, but rather something more like partisan weapons disseminated in ongoing struggles for power in the Norwegian kingdom. And I think some of that kind of political sense is really lost when we encounter documents like this one, not in their material physical form, but rather in the form of an edited volume, edited collection like this one. So that's one strand of my research, with a primary emphasis on material texts and the ways in which they bring people into distinct social and institutional relations. The second strand that I want to talk about in the rest of the presentation surrounds what happens when people start discussing documents, telling stories about them, and what happens when these documents enter into the literary and historical discourses of medieval Northern Europe. And this effort has been really helped by one particular genre of sagas that I've spent quite a bit of time with, and those are the bishops' sagas. Very obscure but very interesting genre of sagas, written in the 13th and 14th centuries in Iceland. What they are essentially are biographies of Iceland's bishops. Some of them are biographies of bishops who had a kind of claim to, or whose authors claim that these protagonists had a kind of sanctity attached to them. Others are more sort of secular in their orientation. And crucially for me, these sagas are full of documents. They're full of real documents, that is, transcriptions of documents that were coming through the episcopal sees in Polar and Skálholt, and they're also filled with imagined documents. So a central theme of my research has been the ways in which these saga authors invented documents in order to repurpose the authority of distant central administrators. And I want to take two examples of this phenomenon, both of which revolve around papal dispensations. Here you have an example of what a papal dispensation looks like. Papal dispensation, of course, is essentially an exception to the rule, something that allows you, that exempts you from a law that was in place within the church. So in practice, papal dispensations were granted in a limited set of predictable circumstances. One of the most common circumstances in medieval Europe was the question of a cleric who was of illegitimate birth. Under normal circumstances, clerks who were of illegitimate birth could not become priests or certainly bishops, but they could plead their cases to the Pope, and if the Pope agreed that they had a good case to make, he could issue then a dispensation that would exempt them from this requirement, so that would allow them to become a priest in spite of the fact that they were of illegitimate birth. And crucially then, the rule that in general that priests should not be of illegitimate birth would remain in place. So what I argue is that Icelandic clerics, the authors of these bishop sagas in particular, latch on to this idea. They latch on to the idea that the Pope can, simply by issuing a document, release a particular case from the power of the law. They latch on to this notion and extend it far beyond the bounds that popes and canon lawyers intended. Specifically, they invent stories in which Icelandic bishops receive papal dispensations for otherwise unpardonable and illegal conduct. And I have two examples of this phenomenon. The first surrounds a 12th century bishop named Jón Bókundarson. And Jón was, by most accounts, quite a holy man, but he had one major problem from the perspective of the institutional church and its legal structures, and that is that he had two wives over the course of his lifetime. He was married twice. And so I won't go into the details here, but suffice to say this is a rather large problem from the perspective of canon law. So Jón's two marriages should have prevented him from holding any clerical office, so he had no business being. They were not at the same time, but interestingly, nevertheless, according to canon lawyers, it still constituted bigamy. So our sense of bigamy is much more restricted. In a medieval context, bigamy much kind of wider frame of reference. So these two marriages should have prevented him from holding any clerical office. He had no business being a priest, and certainly not a bishop, and certainly not a saint, which is what this is what the authors of this text are claiming. So they have a big problem to deal with, and they deal with it by, in a sense, inventing a story in which Jón, after his election to the bishopric, traveled first to meet the archbishop, who notified him that, well, I'd love to consecrate you, but I'm sorry you've had two wives. I'll need to send this case to my boss, to the Pope. And Jón then travels to Rome and pleads his case for dispensation in Rome. And this is how the scene played out according to the saga. So many wise and outstanding men say that, among other things, Jón Electus, that is, Jón, the recently elected bishop, spoke thus before the Pope. Many things discount me from consecration, but the one matter that most prevents me from being a bishop is that I've been married twice. When the worthy Pope Pascal had read over the archbishop's letter and understood with God's foresight the worthiness of Jón, as well as the objections of the laws that seemed to prohibit episcopal consecration, he weighed the wise reasoning of both sides in his argument. And it seemed to him that there were many more arguments for Jón Electus to receive the episcopal office. Therefore, the Pope presented him with an apostolic letter with his bulla, that is, with his papal bull, with the seal, in which he gave Jón Electus a dispensation so that he could be made bishop. So I think a number of things are remarkable here. What particularly stands out to me is the way in which in these writers' imagination, the Pope is essentially a reader and writer of authoritative documents. He's someone who receives this letter from the archbishop and then writes a dispensation himself. A second example, similar in many ways, which surrounds an Icelandic bishop named Guðmundur Ars, a 13th century Icelandic bishop who was quite a different character from Jón, but similar to him in the sense that they both ran afoul of canon law in all sorts of ways. So in Guðmundur's case, he ordained a variety of married clerics. He consecrated wells and springs throughout Iceland, and he was directly involved in all sorts of violent battles. And so again, his biographers are faced with the same sort of problem, where they need to deal with how they can go about pardoning conduct that was otherwise unpardonable, legitimizing conduct that was otherwise illegal according to the church. And And they do that in the same way, in a sense, that Noam's biographers do. They invent a story in which the bishop secures a papal dispensation at the court, papal court, the curia. In Gudmunder's case, he doesn't travel to Rome himself, but rather dispatches a semi-literate Icelandic priest named Ketil to the papal curia with a letter. And this semi-literate Icelandic priest sort of manages to sneak his way into the papal palace, according to the saga, but there he finds himself sandwiched at the back of an enormous crowd, so he can't deliver his petition pleading Gudmunder's case to the Pope. And then the saga tells us the following scene unfolds. So Ketil saw two learned men were kneeling before the Pope, holding a cloth between them. All pleadings under the Pope's jurisdiction, whether composed according to the correct formulae or not, were to be placed on that cloth. Those who stood up front tossed their petitions onto the cloth very gently, and as the letters began to fly with all speed, Gudmunder's priest threw his petition with his right hand, praying that Mary, the Mother of God, would decide where it landed, since he was standing far away and the letter had a long way to travel. And with someone's assistance, the petition landed in the middle of the cloth before the Pope's knees. The original Hail Mary pass. So not surprisingly here, a few days later, Ketil receives a papal dispensation which excuses Bishop Gudmunder for all of his illegal conduct. So again, what I see this as an illustration of is the ways in which Norse clerics were understanding what papal documents could do, i.e. override the normal demands of the law, and then mobilizing those claims to sovereign authority in unauthorized ways, excusing their protagonists for otherwise inexcusable conduct. I think these are both examples of the ways in which peripheral clerics adapted and repurposed the documents of central authorities for their own ends. So that is, in brief, a kind of sampling of my research interests, the ways in which I try to pay both close attention to extant artifacts and also to the secondary discourses surrounding them, trying to trace documents in circuits of ecclesiastical authority in later medieval Northern Europe, and trying to understand how clerics issued, used, repurposed, understood, and wrote official documents, often in unexpected and indeed unpredictable ways.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Megan for having me here today, and thank all of you for being here. Thanks also to my fellow panelists. Very interesting talk, and I'm looking forward to the third one. My talk today is called Reading Against the Grain, Looking for Women and Minorities in Premodern Archives. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of my research in general, sort of get us situated. And then I'm going to give you two examples of texts that I've used in my own research that I think illustrate some of the challenges and possible solutions to looking for people who can be quite hard to find in these kinds of documents. So the primary challenge in my work has been to find sources for the study of pre-modern women and minorities, and of course pre-modern women minorities, the most elusive of them all. In the times and places that I work on, literacy, text production, and archive formation, which that last is incredibly important, were dominated by a very small segment of society, mostly men, mostly elite, mostly Christian, mostly Spanish speaking. Women and minorities did not produce nearly as many texts, and when they did produce texts, those are far less likely to have survived over the centuries. So researching and writing about women and minorities requires both finding new sources in unexpected places and using conventional sources in creative ways. Those are sort of the two main strategies. My research is on the Muslims of late medieval and early modern Spain and the Spanish Muslim diaspora in North Africa. So this is sort of where in the world we're talking about. In the early 17th century, Spain, which was at that time the global superpower, had a Muslim problem. The Spanish crown had been for over a century expanding the power of the empire and the Catholic Church
all over the world. Missionaries built churches and taught the Bible to native peoples in Latin America and in Southeast Asia. Spanish armies fought Protestants in Northern Europe. And yet Spain, the heartland of early modern Catholicism, had its very own Muslim minority living at home. These Muslims were the descendants of the Muslim population of medieval Spain, which from 711 to 1492 was ruled by many different Muslim and Christian kings. Most of these rulers protected the religious minorities within their borders and allowed them to practice their religion. When the Spanish completed their reconquest in 1492, they decided to do away with this tradition of centuries of religious toleration in Iberia. In the early 16th century, they forced the Muslims who remained to be baptized to become Christians, but you can imagine how well that worked. And this here is a relief from the Royal Chapel in Granada depicting the baptism of Morisca women after the conquest. The Spanish tried to make sure that these Muslims, who were now called Moriscos, which means sort of Muslim-like, Muslimish, were really Christians by sending the Inquisition in to hunt for anyone who was secretly practicing Islam. But after a century of that, many of the Moriscos were still practicing Islam at home in secret. They were still speaking Arabic. They were still wearing their Muslim clothing. This presented a dilemma to the Spanish, who were enforcing Christian orthodoxy around the world. How could they allow heretical Muslims to live in their midst? And in addition, the Spanish were worried about security. At war with both Ottomans and Protestants, the Spanish worried about what would happen if they were invaded. Would the Moriscos be loyal to the Spanish? Would they help their enemies? They were also afraid the Moriscos would revolt, which had happened before. The Spanish made it illegal for any Morisco to have a weapon, but that wasn't enough. King Philip III debated a number of possible solutions to his Muslim problem, including sending them out into the Mediterranean in ships that would be deliberately sunk, drowning 300,000 people. Eventually he decided in 1609 to expel from his empire anyone whose ancestors had been Muslim. So I have here a couple of maps that illustrate this. So the total number of Moriscos in Spain on the eve of the expulsion, 1609, estimated to have been between 275 and 350,000 people. About 100,000 in Castile, where they made up about 2% of the population. About 200,000 in Aragon, where they made up about 20% of the population. And of that 200,000 in Aragon, a very large concentration in Valencia, which is kind of the southern part of Aragon, where they made up about 33% of the total population and were a majority in many, especially rural areas. And then here, this is the expulsion, which took place over the course of 5 years, mostly in 1609, 1610. Most Moriscos went to North Africa. As you can see, North Africa is very close to Spain. So most of them went just to the sort of closest Muslim place that there was. A lot of Moriscos, though, went via France, where they weren't allowed to stay, and eventually from there made their way to North Africa. Other Moriscos went further east into the Ottoman Empire, but mostly we're talking about Western North Africa. Okay. So the archives are mostly male-produced, and in the case of early modern Spain, old Christian-produced, right, as opposed to converts from Islam or Judaism. They were the ones who created the documents, who read the documents, who preserved the documents. Spanish Muslims did produce their own documents, but they're difficult to find for a number of reasons. The first one is because beginning in the 16th century, Arabic writing was illegal. So documents had to be hid from Spanish officials, and Arabic writing was also frequently intentionally destroyed, as in the huge bonfires of Granadan books in the early 16th century. And another reason is because the archives that we have today were created by the Spanish state and are filled with state-produced documents for the most part. Some Spanish Muslims brought documents and books with them to North Africa. So there are some sources in Morocco, for example, but Morocco and other North African states don't have extensive state-built archives going back that far, mostly because it's been politically unstable at various different points. So lots of documents don't survive. So in my research, I'm confronted with a problem. How do I uncover the experiences and perspectives of these Muslims, despite the fact that most of the documents we have about them were written by outsiders who were often hostile to them? One strategy that historians have come up with for just this type of thing is called reading against the grain, which is not the best phrase. I'm going to use it here. It's a little bit awkward and vague, and I think represents historians' reticence to talk about their methodology in any kind of concise way. But anyway, that's what we've got, reading against the grain. Essentially, reading against the grain means looking for clues in the text that help us uncover perspectives that aren't the official ones or the ones of the original intentions of the writer by reading critically. This kind of reading is possible using published edited texts, but I think it really benefits from reading the original physical manuscript because those clues can often be in the physical texts themselves or in the organization of the archive. So I have two examples to share with you today. Let's see. This is the first one. I have here my notes from the archive. This is from the Archivo Histórico Nacional in Madrid, where the records of the Inquisition are held. And I have here not a beautiful picture of a manuscript because, as we were talking about at lunch, it's expensive to get copies made in the archives and you're reading hundreds of documents. So what you do is you quickly type out what it says and hope that you were accurate enough. So this is an example of that process right here for you. This is a letter written by a Morisco man named Dr. Jawad, the surgeon, who left Spain for Algeria in 1577. So this is before the expulsion, but many Moriscos left in the years leading up to that because of the hostile conditions in Spain. So this was a very exciting document for me to find. I was looking for accounts of what the process of migration was like for Spanish Muslims. And although we have official reports about ships sailed, numbers of people, that kind of thing, actual first-hand accounts are rare. So first I'll tell you what the letter says, and then I'll explain why it still exists, which is the truly remarkable part. So this is a letter written in Arabic that Dr. Jawad sent to a relative named Muhammad in Valencia from Annaba in what is now Algeria. In it, the doctor recounted his journey from Valencia to Algeria. He first went to Barcelona and from there to Marseille. From Marseille, he went to Annaba with 3 other Muslims. In Annaba, he met a wealthy man. He calls him a qa'id. The Morisco translator rendered this as alcalde, one of those nice little confluences there, who gave him a horse in exchange for medical treatment. In the letter, he says he still hopes to make it to Algiers. He ended the letter beseeching Muhammad not to worry about him and said that he hoped they would meet again soon somewhere. He signed the letter Ali ibn Muhammad. So this letter tells us something about Muslim migration in the Mediterranean that's hard to discern from other types of sources, and that is that Moriscos were able to stay in contact with family members and friends at home in Spain, at least in some limited sense. In fact, how he got the letter to Valencia is something of a mystery to me, since Morisco mobility was severely restricted. It was very difficult to travel back and forth. This letter may be the only one of its kind still in existence, and it survived for 400 years because it was confiscated by the Inquisition and used as evidence in a case against the doctor, who was tried as a secret Muslim in absentia in 1577. In fact, his crime was leaving Spain for Algeria. That in and of itself was considered evidence of his belief in Islam. So while Morisco correspondence is not something that normally the Spanish took care to preserve in their archives, in this case it was tucked in a file that would, centuries later, be transferred to the National Archives in Madrid with the other surviving Inquisition case files from Valencia. Though this letter was the only one I found, there are a number of Arabic texts hidden like this, Inquisition files, that are invaluable to historians. So here's one that I actually do have a copy of. a different kind of document. This is a religious text, but it's another example of an Arabic text that was folded up into tiny little pieces, hid in someone's clothes, and then taken as evidence by the Inquisition. So my second source is an inventory that comes from a published rather than a manuscript source. So when Moriscos in Granada escaped Spain and headed abroad to North Africa, their belongings were then confiscated by the Spanish government. The authorities took note of every single item in the house. And so these inventories are fascinating for reconstructing the material culture and labor practices of rural Moriscos. Many Moriscos worked at home, and so work tools and supplies are often among the household items. So this source is a perfect example of the riches that are out there that are not in obvious places. So this is a book that was published in 1972 in Spain and is a linguistic study. A philologist named Juan Martinez Ruiz published these lists of confiscated Morisco goods because the lists had a large number of unusual Hispano-Arabic words in them. So often colloquial Andalusi Arabic words related to different material objects that without these lists we wouldn't even know these words existed. So these documents are essentially notarial documents. And notarial practice is one way that documents hide the presence of women, because typically men acted as official representatives for their wives and family members when they went to a notary to get a contract made, for example. So these documents rarely mention women, even though we know that women were making contracts and sort of behind many of these notarial documents. So this is a particular one of these inventories here. The first page, the first paragraph, which is almost the whole page here, is notarial formulary, right? Who's present, why they're there, the kind of introductory text that's in every notarial document that can make these very tedious to read also. The second paragraph gives witness testimony to establish the fact that the family in question here did in fact leave for North Africa. Then we have a list of household items, and then a conclusion where the witnesses, judge, and notary all sign. So this is pulled out the actual list of household items. And this is a pretty typical inventory for a rural family. A couple of things to note: there are a lot of textiles. Textiles were among the most valuable items that medieval and early modern families owned. There are several items related to work: tools, a saw and a trowel, a loom, and silkworm cocoons. We're in a silk-producing area here. This suggests that family members were engaged in a number of different kinds of work. There are also two types of textile work here: silk cultivation and linen weaving. None of the tools suggest any highly specialized or particularly high-skill profession. So although these inventories can tell us something about the household economy, it's not easy to see what gender division of labor there was, if any. Right? Like I said, it's a family here, but women are completely invisible. However, occasionally there's a clue that helps us figure out what the broader role of women might have been, and fortunately in this case, there is a clue. The clue comes in the form of a petition made as the officials were concluding the inventory. So this is the petition that comes at the end, and I won't read the whole thing. But here at this last larger paragraph says, "Said day and year Luis Medrano, resident of said place of Inox, petitions Hernando Serra as judge in this case to provide justice, alleging that the silk that the wife of Diego el Gaitero cultivated, she cultivated half from his leaves." So this is not a typical part of these inventories, right? And this brief mention of the silk that the wife of Diego el Gaitero cultivated is the only mention of her in the entire document, right? But from this petition we can tell that the labor of producing the silkworm cocoons was the labor of women. So taken together with other types of sources, passing comments like this one let us piece together the significant role of Muisca women in the textile industry of Granada. So, although it can be difficult to uncover the voices of people who rarely created their own documents, or whose words were rarely preserved for future generations, it's not impossible. It requires critically engaging with these texts and reading against the grain, and resisting the pre-existing notion that just because it's difficult to find people in the sources means it's impossible for us to know anything about them.
Hi. So I don't have a fancy PowerPoint because I don't have any fancy text. I'm gonna present to you a little bit of a paper that I'm working on. It's one of the first sort of more original pieces since I finished my dissertation in June of 2014. So please be kind. I have the beginning of the paper sort of worked out and the end of it less worked out. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on maybe some directions to go with this. So I hope we'll have a good discussion. My paper is called Translating Orality, Theorizing Textual Recordings of African Oral Literature. And this paper must necessarily begin with an articulation of what makes oral literature different from its written counterpart. Oral literature is a really nebulous term that encompasses many genres, all with their sort of own idiosyncrasies. But what distinguishes them really is their method of transmission and presentation. They're dependent upon voice and hearing. Unlike written literature, oral literatures are not solitary pursuits. There must be at least two people involved in the process. This fundamental fact demands a radically different engagement with oral literatures than with written literatures. This distinction may be obvious, so obvious in fact that we don't ever really talk about it. And this is perhaps because the way that most scholars encounter oral traditions today is in their translated form, that is, translated into written text. And it is scholars, of course, who do the lion's share of theorizing and writing about oral traditions, which perhaps is ironic since what we do is write. Yet some of human history's most popular oral traditions are usually encountered via reading and writing. Think about the biblical creation myths, or Gilgamesh, or the Homeric epics. All of these were oral traditions until they were written down. But how often do we hear them instead of read them? We might get snippets maybe in church or in university courses, but really in isolation. We think of these now as books, for the most part. We tend to think of this literature as written literature. Western culture has in many ways become alienated from our past orality, and this can be seen clearly in our historical methodologies. I often joke with my students that historians are the empiricists of the humanities. In our demands for evidence, we often look for permanence, repeatability, some sort of immutable law of historical truth. Though we know that history is a process of interpretation and analysis, we look for that silver bullet, that definitive account that will make us right. Right? I do. I assume you guys do. For all of this effort, though, there are a few subtle historical questions, at least not for more than a generation. I think we have something figured out, and then 30 years later, some young whippersnapper comes along and says, hey, you are wrong, sir, ma'am. Less often ma'am, but now more. But this has also made us skeptical of oral literature, I think, as a discipline. Oral histories have been in vogue for a few decades now, which is exciting. Modern historians have made groundbreaking use of these techniques in order to study everyone from Chinese dissidents to Cuban exiles to women in the Ku Klux Klan. Oral histories have given us the ability to center marginalized voices in our work and to go beyond histories of the elite. But what about older histories? What about oral literatures that do not come from those who experienced or witnessed the events firsthand? These older oral literatures, which are often called oral traditions, are most prominent among indigenous people and have been particularly useful in interrogating the more distant African past, which is what I'm more interested in. In his groundbreaking book, Oral Tradition as History, which was first published in 1985, young Vansina described a process by which historians could use oral tradition as a source that is similar to the written archives found in other places around the world. Vansina himself uses these traditions to much acclaim. His work on the Bakuba in present-day Angola and DRC, as well as in Rwanda, were the first of their kind, and decades later remain exemplars of pre-colonial historical research. I'd like to use Vansina's work in Rwanda as the point of departure for this paper. He and the Rwandan historian Alexis Kagame constituted the first generation of academic historians of Rwanda. They came from very different backgrounds. Vansina was a Belgian-American scholar who helped to build a formidable African studies presence at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is currently being shredded by Scott Walker. Kagame was descended from a ritualist Singa lineage. The Singa clan was the clan in charge of keeping the official royal histories, including the official royal genealogy that legitimized kingship. Though they were contemporaneous for most of their careers, Kagame died in 1981, Vansina is still alive and writing, they were oftentimes mortal academic enemies, in that way that only academics can be mortal enemies. They regularly criticized one another in very harsh terms. They wrote directly at each other in the passive-aggressive way that we do. But for all their differences in ideology and interpretation, Kagame and Vansina share in their treatment of Rwandan oral traditions. And when I'm talking about oral traditions in Rwanda, I'm talking about four main types of oral sources. The Uwiru, which are rituals, the Ubukura Wenje, which are dynastic lists and genealogies, the Ibisijo, which is the dynastic poetry, and the Ubitia Churezo, which are the historical narratives. And those are the ones I'm going to talk about most today, although I will reference the others a little bit. In this paper, I consult predominantly the Ubitia Churezo, which Vansina collected in the late 1950s and early 1960s, as well as Kagame's published scholarship, which he likely takes as its source base, the Ibisijo, some Ubitia Churezo, and what are known as Initia Churezo, which are the secret or esoteric histories. That's what he calls them. God knows what they are. Ubitia Churezo are a form of unregulated oral tradition that were quite popular in what is present-day Rwanda and the surrounding region prior to the abolition of the Rwandan monarchy in 1961. I use the word abolition. Other people use other words. I don't use that word in Rwanda. Unlike oral traditions in other parts of Africa, these traditions were not tightly controlled by the royal court, but rather they were stories that were mostly told by commoners. They take as their subject the histories and biographies of the royal court. As Vansina explains, they were performed often for nobility, though not exclusively. Sometimes they were done in local communities. And the storytellers became popular if they told the stories in an aesthetically pleasing way. The content of the stories could change over time, though unfortunately we don't have the ability to see how they may have been altered from the early 19th century to the 20th. Kagame was decidedly less transparent about his methods for creating his synthetic histories. In some cases, he gives us what are presented as transcriptions, but with no detail about who provided the stories or poems. So we don't know where the transcriptions really came from. Antares Nzabasinda argues that Kagame's transcriptions are themselves syntheses from many storytellers around the country. Kagame's published works have become today not only the official histories for many Rwandans, but also a way of codifying King Rwanda in its written form. What Kagame and Vansina both did was to translate oral traditions into a written form. Both published significant collections of Rwandan oral literature that form the basis of primary sources with which historians of Rwandan oral, pre-colonial Rwanda work today. And in fact, these are basically the only primary sources that present-day historians have regarding the more distant Rwandan past. The monarchy was abolished in 1962, and many loyalist Tutsi were scattered in subsequent waves of refugees to Burundi, Uganda, DRC, Tanzania, Kenya, and the West. Those who stayed were quite old, and the few who had not died prior to 1994 were among those killed in the genocide. Old monarchical figures were amongst the first killed when the violence spread to the southern city of Butara a few weeks into the 90-day slaughter. The members of the royal family who returned to Rwanda after 1996, and there are many, and several are very prominent in the government today, and almost all are living as Anglophone elites in Rwanda. They came back with an interpretation of monarchical history that's heavily influenced by their experiences as refugees and in this Rwandan diaspora. The most distant past is really outside of their concern, and they're much more interested in resurrecting the image of the colonial era monarchy. left with then are really the collections of Kagame and Vansina, with a few other pieces here and there. Though recorded prior to independence, both collections were produced within a tense and uncertain time. Vansina's collection, in particular, came out of the period between 1959 and 1962, a period known in Rwandan historiography as the Hutu Social Revolution, an independence movement not only against Belgian colonialism, but against the perceived illegitimate occupation by the foreign Tutsi, who were believed by this point by many Hutu in Rwanda to have come as conquerors in the 17th century, which is an extremely complicated matter. They did come in the 17th century, were they conquerors? Complicated. Vansina's accounts then are full of flourishes that sort of betray this time period. They have references to Hutu and Tutsi as ethnic groups, for example, which did not exist in the way that we understand them now until around the early 1950s, largely as a result of Belgian mission education. It was a paramount concern for both Kagame and Vansina to preserve these traditions for future generations. Vansina was most concerned with future scholars, and for Kagame, this preservation was a matter of patriotic concern. But their methods of preservation were undoubtedly influenced by their Western educations. They wrote down the traditions, but they only wrote the words. There are many ways to conceive of the act of committing words to paper, to creating written text. It certainly lends a permanence that is lacking in the spoken word. But to what does it lend a permanence? How does it change the text? These are crucial questions for anyone who is working with oral literature. Scholars of oral history emphasize the importance of voice. In their introduction to the edited volume, African Words, African Voices, Louise White, Stephen Nischer, and David William Cohen deconstruct the history of scholars' concerns with finding the, quote, authentic African voice, and the various methods that have been employed in order to feature those voices. They call attention to the normalization of life history in African history as a sort of synonym for oral history. And indeed, by the early 2000s, life history was the methodology du jour for historians of colonial and post-colonial Africa. But missing from these analyses of African voices is any mention of actual orality. What did they sound like? We don't know. Historians have struggled to incorporate orality and performativity into our research presentations, and this perhaps is even more starkly illustrated by our recordings of oral traditions. Vansina, along with Betuel Ogat, and many other of the first generation of non-colonial African historians, reclaimed oral traditions that had been delegitimized by colonization. Ogat writes, with the onset of colonialism in Kenya in 1895, the written word gradually replaced orality. A people without writing, it was alleged, could not have a history, or culture, or religion. The Africans suddenly became voiceless, and memories could no longer be constructed. The Chir, Duol, and Silite, which are Luo forms of education, were soon replaced by mission schools, where the emphasis was on the word of God, the white God. And in the rest of Luo land, silence prevailed, which the visitors constructed to mean ignorance and helplessness. Ogat's references here are crucial in delineating the differences between approaches to history in Western and African traditions. So first, Ogat references the importance of the word in missionary schools. This word is, to missionaries, the written word of the Gospels. Specifically in the case of especially the British colonial missionaries, this word was in English. The missionaries who ran the schools often employed brutal tactics in enforcing the use of English over indigenous languages. A generation of children grew up speaking more English than their indigenous languages, which alienated them from the language and culture and history of previous generations. But methods of education were also crucial here. While children were educated in missionary schools in Kenya as well as most of the continent, they were deprived of older forms of education. In Rwanda, for instance, boy children from more elite families were educated through the Intore, which taught them the skills of a warrior. These were not simply how to use weapons and plan for battles, but also history and dance and poetry. For these boys and the men they would become, these were not separate skills. They were intertwined. A warrior had to understand poetry in order to properly commemorate his fallen comrades. And poetry was not an art form distinct from dance. Movement was as much a part of the praise poem, or the ibisijo, as the words. Dance informed the way that warriors fought in battle, how they used spears and bucklers and short swords. So depriving students any part of this education was not just linguistic loss or linguistic violence. it was the loss of an integral part of culture and history. So this was not education that could be done after hours or in addition to mission school. It was a replacement. Alexei Kagame is the product of a dual education in this regard. Though he was born to a single lineage, he never became a full member of the court historians. He did have access to them. He used them as informants for his synthesized transcriptions, probably. Again, he didn't tell us, we don't know. He calls it esoteric. This is esoteric knowledge. I assume someone told him the esoteric knowledge and he wasn't just born knowing it, but God knows. He also attended mission schools. He became a priest. He earned a doctorate from Gregorian University at the Vatican. And so Kagame is an excellent example of the sort of post-colonial African who used his European education in an attempt to reclaim the culture and history denied him by colonization, which is what Chinua Achebe called a Calvin-esque historian. But Kagame's methodology was a perfect example of this hybridized education. He drew on oral sources, including what he called esoteric sources, but he translated them not only into French, but into the written form. Vancina, for his part, went a few steps further than Kagame in preserving the oral traditions. His collection is actually raw transcripts, which are attributed to specific narrators with descriptions about when and where they're recorded. So we do have a little bit more information, more specific information there. And he also includes the original Kinyarwanda as well as Vancina's French translations. And the French translations, I have to say, are not always super accurate, which is an issue. But what neither Kagame nor Vancina, nor, it must be said, any other scholar who set out to preserve oral traditions, thus far as I can tell, has done was to record anything outside of the words of these oral traditions. So the question that is left when dealing with oral traditions is, have these traditions been faithfully rendered? Are we getting a faithful translation when we look at oral traditions? And so what I would like to propose in my remaining time are some potential strategies for future collection of these oral traditions. And this is where it gets real Wild West, okay? So I've identified a couple, I mean like 6, issues that I think that we can ask questions about in a really concrete way here. The first is that many of the indigenous trained stewards of these traditions have died. If we place the beginnings of colonization at the somewhat arbitrary date of 1885, which is the Berlin Conference, that means that 13 decades have passed since anyone who may have been trained in these literatures who did not feel some sort of impact of European colonization has been trained, right? So I would never argue that colonization was a complete process. Less than 100 years of colonization is not going to erase 5,000 years of history prior to it, no matter how hard it tried. But it would also be a mistake to underestimate the small ways that European culture and ideas infiltrated into everyday African life. So that's an issue, I think, that we have to sort of reckon with. Where oral traditions have already been collected, such as in the cases of Kagame and Vancina, there's little that can be done to recapture the orality and performativity that were left out. So perhaps there are diasporic storytellers who can fill in some of the details, but a lot of this is going to be lost. We just don't have access to these men and women anymore because they're gone. African history has always been sort of the, let's say, unacknowledged child of history. We began as little more than an oxymoron of these serious historians of real civilization. You know, I'm right. After fighting for recognition, we've really had a large impact, which we should be proud of, and I'm proud of. But oral traditions are different than personal recollections or oral history, which has become a really standard historical methodology. And Vancina discusses this at great length in his book. So already in 1985, Vancina is really making this distinction between personal recollections or oral history and oral tradition. And so while I think there are significant reasons that even personal recollections should be considered as fully oral sources as well, this is particularly important in the case of oral traditions. But how do we incorporate this into published work? Is it fair to expect academic presses to pony up the funds to include DVDs with every book on pre-colonial African history, especially given that presses are reluctant to publish these books to begin with? And then how do we learn to do this? We are not taught these methods by the university, not in the West, and not in Africa. Even African historians are trained in the Western style now. Are we expecting African history alone to decolonize the university? And if so, who do we center in that decolonization? what are the implications of this for scholarly authority? These traditions have cultural meanings that differ wildly from the type of ostensibly objective histories that we are expected to produce within the academy. So how do we faithfully interpret them in a context that's completely contrary to their own in which they were produced and the reasons for which they were produced? And to use oral traditions in this way requires a recognition that indigenous stewards of oral traditions were involved in a process of analysis and interpretation, not just rote memorization. In order to fully engage with that, we need to learn not only their words, inflections, and movements, but also their methodologies. This requires historiographical investigation that is far beyond what we have ever done in the past. How do we train historians to do this? Is it even compatible with the academy as it currently exists? And does this require us to do the type of substantively collaborative work that is not generally rewarded by the Western Academy? And so those are my issues and questions. And I propose a couple of answers here, but I'm definitely interested in feedback. Some potential places I think that we can look for answers are a couple places where I think this type of work is being done, but only in a very different context. I think we first look to scholars of translation. I maintain that in this paper that turning oral traditions into written sources is a matter not just of transcription but of translation. Yet few scholars engage with the rich literature on translation that comes out of disciplines like linguistics. So that would be a place to look, I think, to learn how to ask these questions in a better way. I think we also look to ethnomusicology, that we write about the relationship between history and music and ritual and African oral traditions. We often do not analyze them outside of historical framework and using historical methodology. Yet ethnomusicologists regularly incorporate all of these elements into their analysis, so that would be a place to look. And finally, I suggest that we look to the work of librettists. Creating a libretto is something that's probably light years away from the mind of most historians. Yet when we think of a written form that concerns itself with text, movement, tone, and physicality, librettos from opera and musical theater are perhaps the best example. And to me, this is perhaps the most promising place to look, although the most foreign to most historians. So I will leave it there on that question, and hopefully we'll talk a little more. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Libby, Joel, and Sarah for some scintillating and really challenging in different, but I think also intersecting ways. I'm going to open it up to questions now, but again, ask book history students here, Eva and Tess, to kick things off with questions for you guys.
So my first question is for Sarah. We spoke a little bit about how when you write down the oral traditions and oral histories that you add permanence, but you have to translate, but they don't often translate when they write them down. Do you think that any kind of recording of oral traditions or histories loses something with permanence? Like, by losing or like taking away the changeability, is there something that is lost from the possibility of changing through time?
I would say they're definitely altered. And I think especially when we lose the physicality and we lose the actual orality, like the ability to hear and in some ways the ability to respond. I mean, these are not being done in quiet, very hygienic chambers, right? I mean, these are being performed for people, it's performed for an audience. So when you think about, if you go see a play, if you think about the way that storytellers operate, right? There's always a give and take with your audience. And in a way the audience contributes to the way that story comes out, right? And so I do think that is lost. And I think that even if we were doing sort of faithful, video recordings of all of this, to get the physicality and the tonality of the storyteller, you're still missing that back and forth. And I don't know that there's a way to preserve that completely. In terms of the permanence question, I think there's some promise there, because I do think it's something to capture a story in a moment in time.
And we tend to forget this sometimes, I think, when we interpret both text and, like oral text, that these are happening in a particular moment. And so that moment itself is also very important. That sort of temporal contextuality is really important. Yeah.
So maybe I just might be able to follow up on that.
Yes.
Because while you were talking, I kept thinking to myself, well, this sounds not so much like something that a historian is reporting, but maybe might be more profitable conceptualizing as a script for a performance.
Yeah.
And you got towards that when
I
you
get
mentioned
it.
the brand. Actually, but whether traveling and visiting theory of drama might actually be give you a way to conceptualize how to literally put these things on a page that accommodates changing performances. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's, I come from a musical theater background.
Oh, wow.
I thought of this. But I think that there's something there.
Because when you look at, let's say, a script for a play, you already arrive at it with the notion that it is going to be performed differently every time.
Exactly.
And creating paratexts in, your book that you'll have a modern academic publisher create, but giving it paratexts that give us the idea that this is a changeable object.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks.
Yeah, so I noticed that all three of you, your research has to do with the difficulties that come with language and translation in many different ways, and like Sarah, you were saying before, also written. But my question is specifically for Joel and how you've seen language and the politics of language affect the documents, and I'm particularly interested in the fake beautiful extensions. What language was that originally published in, and like, what does that have to do with the politics of that?
Right. That's a great question. So the fake dispensation is fake. So it doesn't exist in the sense that it's not actually transcribed into the saga itself. The sagas, both of them, assume that the document, of course, because it was produced by the papal court, that it would be in Latin. But crucially, the sagas themselves are in Old Norse, which is the vernacular language, which ensures that this story is probably going to be pretty localized. It's not going to have a kind of international audience in the way that a hagiography written in Latin potentially could. So I think that's crucial. I think these sagas are written by people who certainly know Latin and know it well, know it well enough to be able to kind of understand the intricacies of canon law and the operations of the papal court, even if they've never been there, although perhaps one or two of them had. But crucially, they also write in their vernacular Norse, which I think.
Isn't their audience not? Their audience isn't going to speak Latin or understand. So isn't their audience going to be in the vernacular?
Yes, their audience is almost certainly in the vernacular. So it's other clerics, other people in Iceland who can appreciate this sort of story. And again, that's unique too, actually, because both of the examples I mentioned are hagiographies. So at least in theory, in the 13th century, you need the papal court to authorize your worship of a new saint. And certainly in the 14th century. Well, the Icelanders, like many other things, they just don't kind of follow along with that. So they don't write these texts in Latin with one minor exception. So yes, there are real political stakes in these questions.
Did you want to follow up on that?
Well,
No,
not
not
exactly,
really.
but on the physical topic.
Yeah.
You mentioned, or you showed that first document with all the seals. I think you said something that implied that they had all been together physically in the same spot to put the seals on.
Yeah.
And whereas when I first saw it, I thought, wow, that's amazing. That document had to travel all over the place for the people to put their different seals. So I just made the assumption that way. So they physically got together?
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear both from the document itself and from the other chronicle accounts that we actually been the first provincial council called in the Nidaros Archbishopric, again, in sharp contrast to other areas in Christendom where you had provincial councils on a pretty regular basis. But you see the geographic space here necessitates.
So my second question was, to follow.
Yeah.
Did the document itself then travel around to prove this fact?
Yeah, and that seems to be what happened, is that each bishop took a copy of this with you back to his own.
And the seals would have been put on each copy?
Yeah, and the seals are.
And then this is just really just curiosity. What are the seals made of? It looked like it might be wax on bone.
Yeah, it's a seal matrix impressed in wax.
And was the whole thing wax? It looked like it was wax on top of something else.
Yeah, so it's attached to a parchment strip, which is then attached to the document.
Okay, I got the parchment strap, it's just the other, it looked like it might be, wax might be on gold or something.
Len, and then Lori, and then Marilyn.
So my question is open to all three of you. So something I noticed that all of you touched on was kind of human agency in our creation and reporting of human history. It's always been interesting to me how we're the only animals who really care about what has happened before our lifetimes. Like that. I mean, elephants, I
As
know.
far as we know. We're not fluent in all.
Right. I know elephants, for example, have the ability to remember their ancestors, but I don't know anything about their oral traditions. So,
That's a good project.
so I'm curious, how many of you think about the importance of synthetic history in terms of shaping our futures and not just looking back at our past. And this is something I think a lot in terms of like remembering the Holocaust or evils that have happened in our world. We remember them so as not to forget them and so as not to repeat them. But I think that the remembrance of these things kind of keeps them in existence in a way and allows them to find their roots among certain people. So I'm just curious, do you think about creating histories to shape the way you want the world to go?
That's a big question. I mean, in one sense, that's why we do what we do, right? Is because we are shaping the historical narrative in ways that we think are important and bringing things from our past with the ultimate goal of sharing it with the world today and then having those stories around for future generations, right? So I think we probably all do sort of think about that, maybe not consciously, but that's part of, I think, what scholarship is.
One of the things that my students in one of my classes have really been dealing with this semester, one of the things that we kind of come back to a few times is it okay to do bad history in the service of good activism? And particularly the way that we're talking about this is histories of African gender and sexuality, and particularly looking into the African past and looking at same-sex intimacies and claiming them as gay histories. Because this has become really, really important for a lot of gay African activists to look back and say, look, gay Africans have existed since the beginning of time. There's a really huge political component to that. We can't divorce that history from current politics. And these are literally life and death politics. It's also terrible history because that identity simply did not exist in any of these cultures at all in any substantive way, right? Yeah, yeah. So it's really complicated because on the one hand, I do some queer history in my work, and that's one of the reasons I do it, is to sort of like serve this up and say like, look, like, people who, like same-sex loving people have always existed in all of these societies. But I would never go so far as to call them gay because I don't think they would recognize themselves in that definition or in that identity. But on the other hand, I'm also not comfortable telling like Zimbabwean gay activists to like, you can't call them that. Like, leave them alone. It's bad history. I feel like that's wrong. So I think that's I don't know. I think that's a big question, and I think each historian has to define that for themselves.
The scholars are doing that explicitly.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, in the sense that the authors, 15th and 14th century authors of these sagas are kind of creating a past for themselves in order to shape some, I guess, vision of the future, or I think more broadly to shape a vision of where they belong within this giant legal Christian community. And that's why I think that this dispensations are so interesting, in the sense that they allow you to kind of suspend the rule, but the rule itself remains intact. So Icelandic bishops are allowed to, be good members of this legal Christian community, but nevertheless they're also allowed to have 2 marriages, or they're also allowed to
Go to war.
Do all these other things that, that would not be appropriate.
Marilyn, and then in the back.
So, this is Joel, this is good because we can carry on with this. When you were talking about unusual behaviors, I was expecting you to talk about horse hammers or feasting on a horse or something.
Yeah.
All the sort of pagan things that went along with it.
Right.
But my question concerns specifically the treatment of sealed documents, because about a couple hundred years before you're writing in Wales, you had stories about Welsh marcher lords upon receipt of parchments with seals and so forth from the king's way back on the other way, a different place, would force the messengers to eat the document, seal and all. And
Sounds unpleasant.
I don't I've heard the speaker throughout the medieval Welsh history a great deal, and I'm just wondering how apocryphal is that, and if you encountered that story, that same kind of story representing this, exactly, literally eating your words, or this to your trying to put power over me, just is not.
Yeah, I mean, in a general sense, yes, I think this is what documents do, is they kind of project power, and often the power of central authorities, and that's the way in which they are interpreted, and often that's how they're interpreted in the Norse world too. But I see, again, the stories that I'm dealing with as an opportunity to kind of recast or deflect or redirect that same power to use it for their own purposes. So that's the general answer. Specific answer, no, I'm not familiar with any story. No one had to eat wax, at least as far as I know.
So I also have a question for Joel, too, actually. So in terms of these these histories, or these hagiographies, are these legitimizing bishops that we know served out their terms and lived to the end of their days, or is there some kind of alternative narrative about them where they lost their position or something like that? And 2, on the subject of fraud, do we just a great subject? Is there any indication that perhaps this meeting of the 7 bishops was maybe not completely legitimate, and that some of those seals could have been forged or something like that?
Okay, so on the first question, yes, these are bishops who served out the end of their terms. In Jon's case, in Guðmundar's case, he's actually, perhaps it won't be terribly surprising for you to hear this, he's suspended by the Archbishop on 2 separate occasions, and, more or less, but no bishop is appointed in his stead, so he still remains the kind of nominal bishop of Fulham throughout his term until his death, at least. And yeah, the question of fraud is one that's come up in other places in my work. Questions of whether the person attached to the seal actually was there, and this is precisely the issue that is at stake in another chapter of my dissertation. But I do get the sense that yes, that all of these bishops were in this particular place, both because there are several other chronicle accounts that attest to that. But that's the interesting thing about seals, right? Is that they have all of this kind of authority invested in them, but they're also relatively easy to cut off one seal and put it on another document, or a case I've written about pretty extensively is a case where a seal is attached to a document that's blank, so that has no content on it whatsoever. Again, again, the Archbishop's seal.
Blank
And
check.
so,
A blank check.
yeah, so it's a blank check, exactly. And so his messenger has this blank check with him, can write on it whatever he likes, and claim that it's from the Archbishop.
And then left Cam, you're different than I know that.
That's right. So I'm just curious, I've never heard of dispensations. Were those going on all throughout Europe at this time?
Yeah.
And then, that's awesome.
Yeah.
So my other question then being, did the geography kind of help give rise to these fraudulent documents? Because I imagine looking at the maps, it would be harder to make a false document in Italy where there's a bishop every couple miles, opposed to that one guy out in Greenland who's pretty much got free reign.
Yeah. Yeah, so on the first question, yes, definitely dispensations are being issued across Europe. So it's a known quantity, definitely, even I would say out in Greenland. And yes, I think the distance does make a difference here, but perhaps as important is, as I was saying earlier, the fact that these stories are written in Norse, so they're not likely to travel very far. They're not likely to have a kind of international clerical audience. And I guess the other side of this is it's tempting perhaps to see this kind of behavior as kind of easier on the margins, which I think makes sense that it is, but we should also not discount the possibility of forgery right at the center, right at the heart of, at the papal curia itself.
It's easy to hide a needle.
Yes, that's very, that's well attested in previous sources.
Might it also have been more difficult to get an actual dispensation
For
since it's so far away? Or?
Yeah, no, there are practicalities of this, which the papacy actually tries to kind of foresees this in a couple of instances. So they give the bishop in Norway the possibility of issuing like 20 or 25 or 30 dispensations that otherwise you would have had to go to the Pope to get these, but because you're so far away.
Sonia, and then Karen, and then you.
So my question is for Libby, and I love hearing historians talk because I'm not a historian, and so one of the things that I noticed about all three of your papers is dealing with the problem of extrapolation, which art historians, we don't deal with all that much because we just deal with the object that's in front of our eyes. So my specific question for Libby is, in reading against the grain or whatever term you prefer, how have you coped with, or are you coping with, the possibility that some of this evidence is anomalous? So how much can you extrapolate what you find to broader populations?
Yeah, so that's a very tricky and relevant question, I think, and one that historians have sort of answered in all kinds of different ways. I think my sort of default is to assume that things are anomalous and yet still interesting, right? And that still is important, right? To sort of understand something about the range of possibilities, even if that doesn't tell us sort of something general about everyone's experiences.
Oh, wow.
But it is very tricky, and one of the things I do in my own work is a lot of sort of more extended narratives, where I sort of tell a story about sort of one person's experience in a little bit longer form. And that's a question that I get all the time about that, is sort of how can you, if you're going into depth about this person's thoughts and experiences and the things that they saw in their lives, how can you draw that out into sort of a broader experience? And I think for me the answer is that that's sort of not necessarily what I'm trying to do. I'm certainly not going to claim that this means everybody thought the same thing, right?
But that single thing existed is itself
Exactly.
important.
Right.
Qualitative.
Yes.
Karen?
This is again for Joel. I'm wondering whether the culture of documents, seals, etc., if that came in with Christianity. I think Heliodov is just less than 200 years before the 1280, or were kings doing this before?
Yes, definitely, I mean, the culture of literacy, cultures of the book, these are things that arrive in places like Iceland with the conversion to Christianity and with the necessity for missionaries to have texts with them in order to perform the mass or whatever else. As to the documentary culture more specifically, yeah, I think that's coming both from royal centers and from ecclesiastical ones as well. So they're getting documents both coming from the kings of Norway. Those are attested relatively early in king sagas, which is another separate genre of sagas, perhaps from, say, the 12th century, and coming from the church as well.
So, sorry to follow on a little bit. I'm trying to think of the effect among the largely illiterate populace at large, whether, I guess maybe my question is were the Christian documents physically done up locally in the sort of style that royal documents that were promulgated, if they were promulgated, would have been done up for a similar impressiveness, or was this physical style dictated by Rome?
Yeah, so the style or the look of these documents, at least the surviving Icelandic corpus is relatively small, and those tend to be quite humble. But at least from the Norwegian evidence, it seems to be that these are the same sorts of documents that are issued elsewhere in medieval Europe. So not terribly anomalous, at least in terms of their look and, for instance, the iconography of their seals and things like that. And yes, that's a style, I suppose, that's emanating from Rome and from other royal cities as well.
Eva, and then was that a hand?
Yes.
That'll be our last question.
This my question is for Joel as well. Would there have been a status marker, either negative or positively, for there to have a legal dispensation?
That's a great question. A status marker. Yeah, I mean, well, yes. I mean, in the sense that dispensation marks out a very particular status. You know, marks you off as special. You're able to be consecrated as bishop in spite of the fact that you've been married twice and your second wife is still alive. In John's case, so it's a status marker in that sense. And yeah, I think there's also a sense in which, for the kind of literate, Latin literate, educated clergymen in 13th or 14th century Iceland, having an impressive document, particularly an impressive document from Rome, would have been a kind of status symbol. Could point to any number of anecdotes that would attest to that.
So would the perception that people, like the populace would have for this prayer, would they think in either direction, positively or negatively, about this prayer for having such a document, or is it just kind of, oh, this document?
Yeah, I mean, again, perhaps I don't want to propose a general rule here, right? But I think for other members of the clergy, yes, it's important. For the populace at large, yeah, that's more of an open question. And in some cases, you know, we have instances, for example, where people are describing how they're not terribly impressed by the authority that's wielded by a document-bearing messenger, particularly when that document-bearing messenger is from a really poor family. You know, doesn't have a prestigious lineage like all these other people. So there are other systems, you know, there are other ways of marking our status that still have kind of currency in this 13th and 14th century.
Oh, I had a question. It was kind of the whole panel, maybe more particularly for Joel and Sarah. I was just sort of struck by what you were saying, Ruby, about against three readings as a way of dealing with a fragmentary sort of Western yet non-Western archive, trying to recuperate minorities and especially women from that archive, and it just kind of, it struck me that you are sort of a brilliantly composed panel because you're dealing with a fragmentary archive that is lost to us through time, and you're dealing with a fragmentary archive that is lost to us, that is synchronous with our own time, but it's lost to us because of political issues in Rwanda, because of genocide, and because of just the problems of the Western versus non-Western sort of encounter. And so I was going to ask, and taking the against the grain idea from Libby, I wanted to ask you both about, so do you find the, do you use that term against the grain in your own methodology? Would you approach your own fragmentary and in different ways distant archives with that methodology? And does do against the grain readings, do they allow us to recuperate both things lost to the past and both things lost to sort of political complexity? That's it.
Sure, yeah. Yes, kind of. You're reading, so yes, so I'm definitely reading against the grain, which I like sometimes, but not against it. It's a different grain because it is being produced by indigenous people who are reclaiming their history, and so the political situation is really fraught. I feel sometimes like, in order to be a historian of pre-colonial Rwanda, which like itself is like 1,000 years, and so like I'm a historian of the 18th and 19th century specifically, so not all of the things. But in order to do that, I feel like I also have to be a historian of, the colonial and post-colonial periods, because you literally can't read these without that context. There are so many things that I came across in doing my dissertation research that if I hadn't been aware of the conflict between the church and the Belgian authorities and the Tutsi monarchy in the 60s, or in the 50s, that there's no way I would have read it appropriately, and I probably would have, you could read this kind of thing, and you can see where people who do sort of like shorter term historical work. A lot of journalists did a lot of like very short term historical work in Rwanda after the genocide to kind of explain the genocide, and it's where we get these really irresponsible histories saying things like, these are ancient tribal hatreds. Well, if you only read these and don't have any knowledge of of the place in which they were produced, the time in which they were produced, like absolutely, of course, you would read them in this way. Like, oh, ethnicity has existed in Rwanda since the 18th century. Look at this, this thing, it's from the 18th century, Hutus and Tutsis, except that that's from the 1950s, and you can see it in the flourish and the language. But that's also the kind of thing that should be annotated, I think, in the archival text. That's something that you should understand when you're looking at those raw transcripts, that there's some sort of indication that, like, this is obviously a later flourish. And unless you're comparing them, I compare Vancina's collection to Kagame's synthetic histories, which were put together in the 40s, to a couple of like very early sort of colonial era things that were compiled by a couple of other guys in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and you can pick up those things that way. But I think it can be really difficult because people tend to like to read Rwandan history through the lens of genocide, I guess. And so it's I try to do that. I try not to do that in a very like aggressive, almost annoying way. I think to people who really want me to talk about the genocide a lot.
All right, I think we're gonna end here since there is coffee and snacks waiting for us outside. Please join me in thanking our speakers again. And we will reconvene in here at 3 o'clock with papers from Ben Leal, Kim Schweit, and Maria Bovia. I hope you can all join us for that. Thank you guys.